Hello there. Welcome to another episode of the Chuck ToddCast. Whether you're watching on YouTube, listening on Spotify, Apple, or wherever else you might listen, I appreciate you being there. And oh, by the way, I now have a free weekly Substack. It's got a lead item and column in it. Every Tuesday, it's going to drop. Tuesday's the one day we don't drop a podcast. So you see what we did there. So I hope you go over there and subscribe to it. In fact, it's something you've heard me dabble in before, but it's a more thorough analysis of how fragile the two major parties are in this moment. I think both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, as divided as America is between red and blue, right? We're polarized sort of between two sides. The two actual political parties that represent red and blue have never been weaker, right? And essentially and they've been dominated by cults of personality over the last 20 years. When it looks like they need refurbishing, a cult of personality rises up to sort of paper over their problems. Think Barack Obama for the Democrats or Donald Trump for the Republicans. And yet we are watching around the world a movement where we've seen this, there's clearly massive political realignment taking place globally. And what I saw take place in the UK that I brought up a while ago about what happened to the Tories there, the fact that they, at least in these last elections, were not treated like one of the two major parties. If you wanted to vote against Labour, you didn't vote for the Tories, you voted for the Reform Party UK, the Nigel Farage party, if you will. And it's a simple premise to me. It's like, how weak are the two brands of the major parties right now? Think about it this way. If Donald Trump said today, we're going to disband the Republican Party and replace it with with a new political party, the MAGA party, who's with me, I'm going to guess 70% of the elected Republicans would sign up for the new party. And suddenly you would have a complete exodus from the official club known as the Republican Party. Similarly, if Pete Buttigieg, Andy Beshear, Gretchen Whitmer, AOC banded together and said, you know what, the Democratic brand is broken. It is a mess. It doesn't, it's not what it used to be. We need a new left of center party in this country that is focused on preserving the democracy and expanding and thriving and updating it. We need a modern version of this. So we're going to start a new party. It's sort of like taking the Donald Trump NAFTA approach, right? Which is, can't stand NAFTA. So here's the new NAFTA. I got rid of NAFTA because we don't call it NAFTA anymore, but he kept NAFTA. He just renamed it, right? That is arguably how badly the two brands are feeling these days and how easily they could be rebranded into a new party. And the fact is, when I give you those two potential outcomes of how fragile the two major parties really are, the only thing that keeps them afloat is the duopoly they have on ballot access in the 50 states. If they didn't have this duopoly of ballot access, one or both of these parties would have probably disappeared at least a couple of decades ago. But because of the vehicle that they are for ballot access, in fact, that actually is connected to my guest today, Rob Sand, the newest candidate for governor in the state of Iowa. He's basically the Democrats' great hope for winning statewide in an actual red state. And I'll get more into Rob Sand in a minute. He's currently the only statewide elected Democrat in the state of Iowa. He's been the state auditor for 2 years, and Democrats have been waiting for him essentially to finally take the next step, whether it was for a Senate seat or a gubernatorial seat. And you will hear why he's a Democrat. And it's simply because there is no other alternative. If being an independent were a viable alternative, it sounds like he would be there. And it's, for me, a reminder of how fragile I think both parties are these days. The Democratic brand is so bad in some places that it is more appealing to some Democrats to run as an independent. Take the newest candidate for governor in the state of Florida, Jason Pizzo. Do realize he was the Democratic leader in the state Senate, in fact, just a couple of weeks ago. So here he is, technically a leader of the Florida Democratic Party, deciding to abandon the party. Now, some of that may be personal. Some of that may have to do with personality clashes with the current head of the Florida Democratic Party. There's a little bit of finger pointing that, because if he doesn't get his way, that's why he left the party. But the fact that he has some resources to do it. And I've told you, I think there's definitely Republican fatigue in the state of Florida, a lot of DeSantis fatigue in the state of Florida. I don't know if the Democratic Party brand is strong enough to take advantage of it, but I do know if there's a strong independent candidate, it could. It's fascinating to me that the potential leading Democrat in Florida decided to run as an independent, this Jason Pizzo, and the leading independent candidate, a former Republican congressman and lobbyist named David Jolly, decided to become a Democrat and run for governor that way. So it'll be really interesting to see if you're trying to fix the Democratic Party brand, is being a former Republican turned Democrat the way to go, as a way to sort of moderatize it or centrism, infuse a little centrism in it and sort of de-leftify the brand in Florida. Leftify, de-leftify. Did I invent a word there? Or is it being a former Democrat running as an independent? And in some ways, we're going to see both experiments take place there on that front. In fact, I'm fascinated to watch what's going on in some of these Senate races in 2026. You know, you've got John Cornyn, the incumbent Republican senator from Texas, who's being primaried by the state attorney general Ken Paxton. Paxton is very MAGA, was just like Donald Trump, escaped an impeachment attempt. He was impeached but not convicted, narrowly. Remember, Texas is a pretty Republican state, so quite a few Republicans voted to impeach him in the state house, and quite a few Republicans voted to convict him in the state Senate, just not enough. So you do have a pretty divided Republican Party. And it's a fascinating problem that the national Republicans have with their Texas primary. And this is actually a problem they're starting to percolate throughout the Senate, you know, as more people debate, is the Senate in play in 2026 for Democrats? The map's terrible for Democrats, but Republican infighting could actually put more seats in play for them. And we've seen, it's not as if this movie hasn't played before in the theaters, right? In 2020, Democrats overperformed in Senate races thanks to bad Republican nominees. In 2022, Democrats overperformed in Senate races thanks to bad nominees. In 2024, Democrats overperformed in Senate races thanks to what? Say it with me. Bad nominees on the Republican side of the aisle. So here we go again. And so if you're the National Republican Party and your job is to prevent the Democrats from winning the state of Texas, the best possible way to do that is to ensure that John Cornyn is the Republican nominee. But what if John Cornyn is simply not popular enough inside the MAGAfied version of the Republican Party in the state of Texas to win that nomination? Ken Paxton, if he's the Republican nominee, makes that seat a lot more vulnerable to the Democrats winning. So if you're the National Republicans, do you convince John Cornyn to pull a Lisa Murkowski and just simply bolt the primary, run as an independent, and try to win a three-way race in Texas? I know on one hand you can think, well, that's crazy. On the other hand, John Cornyn, the only shot he may have to win this seat is if he leaves the Republican Party, promises that he will caucus with the Republicans like Lisa Murkowski, right? She knew she couldn't win a Republican primary in Alaska, but she also knew she was more popular with independents and with Democrats and with enough Republicans that she could easily win a general. And she did it as a write-in. And her last name is Murkowski. I still always find that. It's like, you know, why is she untouchable? Why can't Trump get rid of her? Because she's so politically popular in Alaska that with a Murkowski, with a 3-syllable last name that isn't quite easy to spell, she won as a write-in, okay? That's your mic drop, Murkowski. If your last name was Smith and you ran as a write-in, not that impressive. Murkowski, another story. So, which brings me back to Texas. I think the real dilemma there, either because I don't think Cornyn's ever going to win this primary. And what it's going to take for him to win this primary is probably going to divide the Republican Party so much that it may become an untenable situation in either direction. A three-way race, suddenly, who knows, right? I don't think it works the way everybody thinks it works, that 2 Republicans on the ballot automatically will help the Democrat there. I don't think that's the case. I think Ken Paxton would do more to get the Democrats a chance at Texas than a three-way race would. But that's the type of conversation that I think Republicans should be having with themselves in Washington. Of course, it all matters is who's making these decisions. If this is Trump's political team, well, they'd rather have Trumpy people. But if this is, say, John Thune's political team and Tim Scott, who's the current NRSC chair, well, they may have a different point of view. But I do find what's happening in Texas now to be something that it could lead to, again, if Cornyn's goal is to win the Senate seat, it may be his best path to win the Senate seats to leave the party, run as an independent, and promise to caucus with the Republicans. You can't just not. I do think that trying to keep your, if you don't go promise to go there, then you would eliminate potential Republicans that might vote for you. But I think that would likely be, and especially Colin Allred's the Democratic nominee. Colin Allred ran a race that basically said, "Hey, I'm a John Cornyn Democrat." All he did was praise John Cornyn. So I think he'd have a harder time being able to differentiate himself from Cornyn, and Cornyn may actually benefit from having a third candidate in the race that's done nothing but praise him. So it is, I think, something worth watching there. As I have a few other campaign nuggets I want to share. The Republican Party is dealing with too many crowded primaries with these Senate races. We talked about Texas. There's North Carolina, where now Laura Trump is once again thinking about wanting to be in the Senate. Maybe she primaries Tom Tillis. Tom Tillis is somebody who's seen as quite vulnerable to the MAGA wing of the Republican Party. He's another one where is Pat McCrory's experience not being able to come even close to beating Ted Budd. He was the non-MAGA Republican. Ted Budd was the Trump-endorsed candidate, and we saw what happened there. If Tillis, is it in the best interest of the Republican Party in the Senate, if they're trying to keep that seat, to have Tom Tillis run as an independent? He's another one. Again, the ballot access laws are not easy in North Carolina. Ditto with Texas, to run as a third party or as an independent. Don't get me wrong. But in both of these cases, and I'd throw in Bill Cassidy in Louisiana, where the governor is working with the president to try to find a Republican primary challenger to Bill Cassidy. Julia Letlow, a congresswoman, is the latest idea being floated. Would Cassidy be better off running as an independent? So, it is again, my bigger theme being, you have two party brands here that are broken. You have two party brands that I think are very distrusted by the public. You have two party brands that where it may be easier running away from that party brand, even if you agree with 70% of what that party brand stands for, and running as an independent. If you're a Democrat in Florida, if you're a Democrat in Iowa, if you're a Republican now, a non-MAGA Republican in Texas, or a non-MAGA Republican in North Carolina. So I definitely think it's something to watch for there. A couple other news topics from the last few days that I want to talk about here. One is, of course, this Biden book. The excerpts are coming out. The book, I'm going to have Jake Tapper on pretty soon, who's co-author with Alex Thompson of this book about that is about the Biden cover-up. Was it a cover-up? Were there people inside the West Wing not telling the truth, or being disingenuous when people like myself would inquire about why Biden couldn't do this event or that event, or was afraid of doing a Super Bowl interview? All of those things, that we all saw with our own eyes, that he clearly, there was something afoot. But of course, you're only as good as your actual sourcing there. And it's pretty clear a bunch of aides did their best to prevent people from knowing any truths, right? Keeping cabinet secretaries away from him, keeping Biden away. But there's something, as much as I think it's terrible that the Bidens are once again trying to come out and defend themselves, putting themselves before the party, they ought to take a page from George W. Bush, right? After Obama won, after it was clear the Bush brand was done inside the Republican Party, he didn't go out there to try to fight for his legacy. He went and took up painting, right? And in many ways, by not trying to be out there engaging every day in his legacy, and thanks to Donald Trump, his legacy is oddly improved in the minds of many voters, certainly his personal legacy. There's still a lot of people who question whether, the greatest mistake made since Vietnam was the Iraq War. And I don't think anybody that isn't going to change. And but certainly his character is in his sort of how he how he treated the institution of the presidency as something that has only grown with time, and not trying to make people uncomfortable by coming back out to defend himself and to say, no, my unpopularity is wrong, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think that the Bidens ought to but I get human nature wanting to defend yourself. But there's something about these books where you're going to have all these people make anonymous claims that, well, they were hiding it, or they were doing this, or they were doing that. Well, then shame on you. You own this. If you believe the country is at risk of slipping in the democracy, shame on you. And all of these anonymous aides, and frankly, all the people that worked for him that are now, they tell us, this is one of those, I think it's Brian Curtis over at The Ringer dubs these stories in the sports world, right? Every time somebody gets traded, you're like, oh, there's something. And then like right after the person gets traded, then all of a sudden the beat writer for said team writes the big tell-all story about how the relationship between player X and the ownership totally broke down. And he calls it a now they tell us. And this is a now they tell us, right? So now all these Biden aides who didn't say a word for 2.5 years are suddenly now speaking anonymously to folks. It is, or early aides coming out. Where were you at the time when many of us were pointing out he seems to be too old to be running for president? I know I did it quite a bit publicly. You had people like David Ignatius. And you know what many of those same aides did who are now talking to these authors? They would push back privately and publicly with me and others and say, no, it's fine. No, my interactions with them are fine. This is just exaggeration. You're buying into a right-wing narrative. So, these people have talked about both sides of their mouth. So I in many ways, I think this Biden book is only going to not just undermine Biden, but I think make it toxic for anybody that worked for Biden. Because then it becomes, where were you? How did you participate in the cover-up? Pete Buttigieg, this may mean something for you. You were a cabinet secretary. You're going to now tell us, yeah, I didn't have much interaction with him. Well, then why didn't you say something? I had a cabinet secretary tell me that. They had no interaction with him and wondered about that. I had that off the record. After Biden quit, I've since shared it with people. I'm still not going to share who the cabinet secretary was because that's not I'm trying, I believe in keeping your word as a journalist, and it was an off the record as far as it being told to me. And I think it's up to that person to decide whether to speak out or not. But I think it's a question, anybody who worked directly for Biden. So Gina Raimondo, if she thinks about running for president, Pete Buttigieg, all of these cabinet secretaries are now going to have to answer for all of this. And I do wonder if it's going to make anybody that touches Biden persona non grata, not just anybody directly in the Biden world, as far as, the generation that lived through this mess will have to go away before they maybe get a second chance at the historical record. A lot of it, though, is going to depend on what the Trump presidency looks like 3 years from now and what kind of impact it has. Because everybody who worked for Biden and Joe Biden himself, to me, is directly responsible for everything Trump does in the second term, right? Their behavior and their actions led us to this place. They're contributors to the place we are at. So they better hope it's a successful second term for Trump, because they will own a piece of that failure too. And the recovery for America from its what could be an economic disaster. Obviously we're escaping short-term problems here by this pause with China. But let's be honest, already his management of the economy has cost a lot of people money, and it is still going to create inflation. So it is now, he's already done damage. The question is, can he mitigate the damage he's done, or is more coming? He's just delayed when that happens. But mark my words, if you're not happy with any part of this second term and you're angry, some of that anger belongs to the Bidens, and some of that anger belongs to the people who had no guts to speak out when it mattered and waited till talking to an author of a book. Finally, there's the story of the DNC and this issue of David Hogg, who, of course, was an activist born out of the Parkland shooting in Florida. I'll be honest, it's very personal to myself. I have my own connections to somebody who was in that school when it happened. So I have a lot of personal empathy for anybody that went through that. I think the way David Hogg has conducted his politics is hard to to see him as a member of the leadership of the DNC, considering what the role of the DNC is. Now, there's obviously people that are unhappy with him that as vice chair of the DNC, he got elected vice chair of DNC, that he now wants to work with a group to primary essentially Democratic incumbents in very blue areas who he believes are stagnant, right? Who need generational change and all of this. This has created an uproar that a member of the DNC leadership is talking about primarying elected Democrats. And I understand that criticism. It's like, wait a minute, you can work on the outside. You chose to work on the inside. When you choose to work on the inside, you're choosing to work with the Democrats that have been elected and help new Democrats get elected, not necessarily purge the party from the inside. So I have empathy for the criticism of Hogg. But now they're trying to create so apparently now they've come up with instead of forcing the situation about, okay, you've got to make a decision, David Hogg, are you going to work on the outside or work on the inside? They've come up with a convoluted, it feels like a Politburo decision. Well, we've got to figure out how to get rid of this person, but we don't want to make it look like it's politics. We want to make it look like it's a technicality. So in this case, there was a challenge. There's supposed to be gender equity in the leadership of the DNC. Well, when the DNC chair won, and it turned out to be a man, not a woman, it should have triggered that one of the vice chair that there was going to be gender equity on the vice chair level, and there was not. So there's been a complaint filed. So now the DNC has decided they have to redo this vice chair race. So all they've done is and David Hogg has said, well, this is really about them being angry at me. They're just using this technicality to force a new vote. Malcolm Kenyatta, who was the other person elected vice chair, clearly doesn't like that he's been attached to the David Hogg controversy. He's upset about this. Let me just tell you something. I think the DNC looks ridiculous right now. Just effing ridiculous. It's behaving like a Politburo and not like an actual functioning political party in a democracy. A Politburo would come up with a convoluted technicality to purge somebody from the leadership because it's making other people unhappy, rather than actually dealing with the issue straight up front. So what they've done is they're actually going to make a martyr of Hogg. Like I said, I'm not sitting here. I don't think what Hogg was doing was I thought it was poor form. I thought it was in bad taste, right? To be elected a member of the leadership and then work to sort of purge Democrats. But I also think the way this entire episode is being treated, how the chair is dealing with this, how it's turned into this backroom thing, only makes the whole party look even less organized than we all thought they were. Clearly, there's a leadership vacuum. This has not been a good start for the new DNC chair, Ken Martin. I could tell you there's quite a few Democrats I hear from who are wondering why the chair of the Wisconsin party, Ben Wickler, who now is leaving there, who's had a ton of success, why he wasn't elected chair, and openly wondering would he be allowed this mess to go on. And I think for whatever reason, Ken Martin is not taking a strong hand on this. Feels like he's almost letting insiders get involved too much on this. Either way, it looks ridiculous. It's going to make a martyr out of David Hogg. And either he's elected again, which is, talk about major, with everybody knowing this, giant amounts of egg on their faces, or they don't, and it looks like a bizarre party purge, and all you've done is thrown fuel at the fire of the insurgent class wanting to get rid of the establishment. So it is one of those massively unforced errors, and leave it to the DNC to somehow get in its own way while they have this target-rich environment in what has been a sort of incompetence on the Trump administration, whether it's in government cutting, managing the economy, or all these very shady deals that seem to be taking place in the new crypto capital of the world, in the Arabian Peninsula there. And yet it's the Democrats shooting at each other, just making a mockery, frankly, of their own party here. And just they're going hog wild in all the wrong ways. All right. So coming up, I got Rob Sand. And here's why you need to care about this race. This is easily the best chance Democrats have of truly having a red state governor to stand next to Andy Beshear and Laura Kelly, Andy Beshear of Kentucky, Laura Kelly of Kansas. This will easily be their best shot at it. And I'll tell you this, if he wins, Iowa is going to be the first in the nation caucuses. They will get their place back. If Sand proves that they can win in this environment, and it will be a better environment for him to run in than he ran in 22, if he wins that race, it will put Iowa back in first in the nation, which will be really good news if you're Pete Buttigieg, although, as I pointed out, I do think his Biden baggage is going to get heavier and heavier as he goes about. But take a listen to Rob Sand, because this is a guy who's sort of, you'll hear it, kind of reluctant Democrat. And, previous episode, I had Jasmine Crockett, she's not a reluctant Democrat, but she's got a point of view of how the party should be messaging now. I think you'll hear a different point of view from Rob Sand. So be curious what you think. Of course, let me know at askchuck@thechucktoddcast.com. And with that, I'll sneak in a break. And afterwards, you get Rob Sand. Well, joining me now is somebody who is a new candidate for office, at least a top statewide office. It is Rob Sand. He's been the two-term Democratically elected state auditor of Iowa, and he's now announced that he's running for governor. And to timestamp this, I'm interviewing him about 4 hours after he unveiled his public campaign for governor. So, Rob, you've been arguably looking to this moment for a few years now. How does it feel now that you jumped in the water?
I'm excited for this moment, Chuck. I think one of the things that really crystallized it and made it clear that it was necessary was the gutting of the auditor's office bill that took effect, I think, about not quite 2 years ago, where the Iowa legislature and the governor literally made it legal for state agencies and departments in Iowa to hide documents from the state auditor's office. It's the kind of thing that just makes you go, okay. Like,
what do you believe it was a direct partisan attack on your office, meaning you had a lot of success running, doing public corruption.
Yeah.
And because you're a Democrat and the legislature's Republican, how much did that factor into the defunding of your office?
I would say this. It was really more of a question of being serious about trying to do the job and do public service, as opposed to being one of the insiders that's like, oh, you don't want me to dig into that program? Well, don't worry about it. Then I won't, because you told me not to. And hey, we're all friends, right? That kind of stuff. Because I wouldn't go along. I wouldn't do the go along to get along kind of thing. And so I think that, yes, it was easier for them to do it because I was a Democrat. But if I had been a Republican who was really serious about public service, not politics, they would have tried. I just don't know if they could have gotten enough majorities to go along with it, because we had bipartisan opposition in the Iowa House to it as it was.
Right. Well, I would imagine. I mean, again, public corruption is always one of those things that there's usually pieces of both parties that are bipartisan in favor of strengthening public corruption, offices that target public corruption, and then those that believe, for a variety of reasons, some may be nefarious and some may be intellectually honest, that, it gets in the way of business, right? It gets in the way of regulation, or it gets in the way of government service. So I buy that. But let me ask you this. I think your job, being auditor, to me would both be interesting and also, though, sometimes a negative place to come from. And here's where I'm curious, where the auditor's job is to find waste, fraud, and abuse, right?
Yep.
Essentially, right? And so if you don't find it, does it mean everything is going well, or you didn't do a good enough job looking for it, right? Like, I feel like I don't feel like you could ever feel satisfied that you're doing the job, that you've found everything, because I think the public is probably like me, a little bit cynical, assuming, well, there's always a little bit of public corruption. The question is, are you finding it all?
Yeah. And I think there's going to be a great piece for this, which is a great answer for that here. We uncovered a record amount of misspent money in my first term, and the answer to that from politicians in Des Moines was to go, hey, we got to stop this guy. He's actually doing his job.
Rather than saying, hey, this is great, should we reform our practices? Right.
Thank you.
Right.
Yeah. You'd think that that would be the answer, but that's the difference. And that to me is I think at the heart of this campaign, it's
Mhm.
really the question of public service and government trying to serve all Iowans
Mhm.
versus politics and having it serve insiders and special interests. And I don't think that you could have a clearer example of that
Yeah.
than literally them looking at us doing our job really well and going, we got to slow him down.
Did you think about not running as a Democrat, but running as an independent?
Look, I guess I'd say this. Um, People who know me, I'm glad that you asked that question, because people who know me know that I'm not satisfied with a two-choice system. And I think it's important that we talk about that. The bottom line is most of us have experienced this in the ballot booth, where we
Mhm.
look at our options and we see Democrat, Independent, Republican, and we see the Independent and we like the Independent, but we're also like, man, if I vote for the Independent, I know I'm just throwing my vote away. And there's that
Mhm.
frustration of just sort of the being trapped, right? Being a prisoner
Mhm.
of this system while we are also participants in it.
Mhm.
That's the bottom line. It's the same question for a candidate. So I would love to have a system in Iowa where independent candidates can actually get elected very
Mhm.
easily, but we're going to have to change how the system works before we get there.
How would you change that in Iowa to do that? I mean, look,
Yeah.
I take your point here. Um, and yet I would just sort of warn you and other people. I bet you the Tories didn't think that they were ever going to get knocked out from their top two status in political parties in the UK. And guess what they just saw happen to them?
Yeah.
And the Democratic brand is quite weak, particularly in the agricultural Midwest, even at a time when it's not as if the Republican brand is doing great.
Yeah.
It's just, they've succeeded by not being the Democratic Party brand. You being an auditor, I would argue it's better to be an independent than to be a member of either political party, right? To feel like you could
Yeah.
truly function in that
But
job.
again,
That's why I asked that question.
sure. But if you do that, then you get back to the same thing, which is if I run as an independent, the Republicans go out and they collect petitions to have somebody run as a Democrat, and they have someone register as a Democrat, or they find
Right.
some absolutely furious Democrat who's so mad at me for running as an independent. And then
Right.
you've got a three-way race, and we all know what happens. I am the spoiler, or maybe it's the Democrat that's the spoiler, but
Right. Either
it's over
way.
before it begins because of the way
Yeah.
we structure elections, right? So the
Yeah.
answer to how you do that in Iowa um, is again like, and well, I want to go to a different piece of your point here about the Tories
Mhm.
and sort of being a favored party. This is supposed to be about solving problems. Government is
Mhm.
supposed to be about people coming together and deciding, okay, what do we need to address this issue? How do we address that issue? So
Yeah.
many of our founders warned us, watch out for factionalism, right? Watch out for
Yeah.
partisanship. And we're at the point here where people actually say, like, oh, well, you'd have to be careful about that, because what if then you're not electing a Democrat? Well, what if we were actually solving lots and lots of problems,
Mhm.
but we were having people with a different letter behind their name,
Oh, yeah.
whether it's Republican or independent or anything else, do it. I'm here for solving problems. And I think as long as we uh, have a system that
Yeah.
allows elected officials and candidates to sort of say, well, I don't have to solve your problems as long as I can convince you that so and so over here is worse than me. I don't think we're solving a lot of problems because there's no incentive to do it. And so I
So
think
you're
the
running.
answer, to be more
Yeah.
specific, if you want the
Yeah.
more specific answer, right now in the state of Iowa, independent voters are not allowed to participate in primaries that their tax dollars pay for. I think that's wrong. So
I
I think
agree.
we should have a single open primary.
Right.
And then I'd love to see approval voting on the second side of that for 3 or 4 or 5 candidates. So
So
here's
I
the
look.
3 to 5 that make it through to the general. Vote for all of them that you approve of. There is no
Yeah.
ranked choice. The tabulation is available automatically. It's easy.
And then the general is a 50%, whoever gets 50% wins, or just top vote getter in your
Just top vote
fantasy.
getter. So this is what Fargo, North Dakota does. They
Mm.
you have 4 or 5 candidates in the general
Right.
election, and you as the voter, you can vote for all of them or one of them, just however many you approve of. And so whoever has the most votes still wins the election, plain and simple.
Yeah. That seems rational and logical, which will mean it's
Never, so it could never
impossible.
succeed, right?
Never succeed. You don't have the duopoly isn't going to allow for it to happen. So describe your relationship with the Democratic Party. You've been a Democrat
Sure.
your whole life, but is it if you win, is it a victory for the Democratic Party, or is it a victory for independence in your mind in Iowa?
So I was registered as an independent when I first registered to vote. I did register as a Democrat soon after that because I realized in order to vote in the primary, I had to pick my poison.
Right.
The difference is I still talk about the fact that it was poison that I picked.
Do you still feel that way? I mean, I feel that way
Yeah,
about political parties because I'm a character voter. I really am a
yeah,
character and a problem solver voter. So
yeah.
I'm lucky enough to live in a state in Virginia where it's no party registration. You get to pick which primary you vote in. You pick for that cycle, but you get to pick whichever one you want. It's a little more choice. So I certainly, as a journalist, like that too, because you can't pigeonhole me by looking at my voting record. Oh, he's always voting Democrat or always voting Republican. But I like that just as a voter, and I assume more voters like that. But it does sound like you're a reluctant partisan.
I'm a public servant. I live in a system where, in order to be effective, just like when I was a voter in my early 20s, I have to choose one or the other. And so that's what I've done. If I win, is it a victory for the Democratic Party? That would be for other Democrats to decide. I've never been to the DNC. I'm clear about what I believe. I'm clear about the fact that I'm a Democrat because I have to pick one or the other. I think that if I win, then maybe that helps other people figure out what's effective out there. But I'm not doing it. I want to be a public servant to the whole state of Iowa. I don't want to be a leader for a political party. In my time at the state auditor's office, we had Democrats, independents, and Republicans always in senior leadership. I actually appointed people to the most senior positions in the office who had made campaign contributions to my opponent from 2018. I think it's important to do that because
Do you plan on doing that if you win this time?
I would absolutely do that if I win. Yeah, I would want to have a bipartisan cabinet 100%, or a
Somebody that
tripartisan.
may
I'd
be a
like to have some
donor,
independents. Yeah,
somebody that may be a contributor to the eventual Republican nominee. And I saw that Congressman
it's a lot easier to find. You got a bigger circle to cast from if you just say a voter or a supporter or a registered Republican. But if I found someone who was a donor who also was well qualified to do the work, that wouldn't stop me. It hasn't stopped me in the past.
So let's talk about, you're running because you think the direction of Iowa has been going in the wrong direction. So let's talk about that. From the outside, the biggest change that I've noticed that Governor Reynolds did had to do with school funding.
Yep.
And it's certainly when you're on the ground in Iowa, when you get past the sort of the red versus blue, the national conversation, and you ask what's going on in Iowa, that's usually the first issue I hear about. Is that still the first issue you hear about?
It's that, and it's rising costs, which is obviously a issue that's driven mostly by national politics and international politics. But yeah, education is way up there. And the bottom line on that to me is just the complete lack of accountability for how those vouchers, how that money gets spent. The money is required. So was $100 million last year, and the Reynolds administration didn't let us audit the controls of the program. Again, they used that new law, just as we predicted they would, to literally hide our ability to see what was going on with money. But even Chuck, if the program is working the way it's supposed to, all of that money, the whole 100 million, has to first go to tuition. Once it's paid as tuition, there's only one thing on God's green earth that can't be done with the money with private schools. They can't pay a rebate to parents whose kids are going there, but that's it. Any other way they want to use the money, totally legal, and we're not allowed to audit it. So I don't even know how we would find out. That to me is insane.
Are you allowed to audit the public school use of taxpayer money?
Public schools are audited every year in the state of Iowa. Now we have $100 million.
Private schools using taxpayer dollars are not going to be scrutinized at all.
What are we doing here? What are we doing here? It blows my mind. But again, it's part of the reason that it's like, okay, like we need a change in direction. Like this state truly is in a moment where their focus on the people they're taking care of is tiny. There are 3 million people in this state. And they're taking care of insiders. They're taking care of special interests. Odyssey, the company that runs the program, we found out after months of stonewalling, they actually doubled the pay for Odyssey to administer the state's voucher program with no additional obligations on behalf of Odyssey in return. They just said, you know what? We told you we're going to give you this amount of money. We're going to double it. Happy birthday. Have fun.
I want to dig into this because to me, the biggest challenge for the school choice advocates is rural America. I'd love, if you live in rural parts of this country, whether it's in Iowa, Florida, Texas, these are three states
Yeah.
that have been very aggressive about this. It's not like it's easy to start up another school. And either you're going to have some questionably accredited people trying to do startup schools in areas that they've never done it before, and they're going to be using taxpayer dollars to experiment, and it could fall on its face. That's something we, found out in Florida. If you had a good administrator, maybe the school went well, but if you didn't, all of a sudden money disappeared and parents were wondering where's all these promised teachers. But I've noticed, particularly in rural parts of Texas and Florida, even among very conservative voters, they're very nervous about this because they're like, where's the choice? You're really basically saying, I either homeschool my kids and maybe you're going to give me some money to do that, or I maybe get into a pod with some other like-minded parents. But that is actually, why can't we just make the school in my neighborhood better?
Jim Pillen in Nebraska, Republican governor, said, maybe 3 years ago, hey, we are going to really increase our investment in Nebraska public schools. And what do you know? According to U.S. News and World Report, Nebraska is now ranked higher than Iowa for public schools, which, as an Iowan and someone that has a rivalry with Nebraska the way much of my state does, really annoys me.
And you grew up there. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in the 90s, and this is when you were going to school there, Iowa, Massachusetts, they were in the top 5 all the time as far as public school. I mean, the Iowa public school system was something that was the envy of others in the Midwest, was it not?
We put it on our quarter. Our U.S. quarter for Iowa says foundation in education, and now we're in the middle of the pack. It is embarrassing.
Because they've pulling, again, I understand the frustration with a specific local school that parents can have, right? And this doesn't feel like solving a problem. This just feels like, we know you don't like it, so here, go, let's create competition. But not everything could, look, we can't create a competitive U.S. mail service. Okay. A service is a service. What you do is you improve the service.
Well, and I want to, they like to throw around this phrase school choice. What that really means is that private schools get to choose their students. Right. The public schools, you walk in the door, hey, we're going to educate you. The rule should be, hey, if we want real competition, well, competition means everybody follows the same rules and may the best fill in the blank win, whether that's a football team or a school. You want to have competition? All right, fine. Yeah. Private schools, in order to get this money, you too have to take every student that says they want to attend there. Oh, well, that's hard. It's hard to plan. Yeah, well, that's a difficulty that public schools face. You said you wanted to have competition. Same rules apply.
Rob, you know what's common around here, and it's common everywhere. But I could just tell you from experiences. I have some parents who have a child that maybe needs some extra help, special needs, some in different variations. Private schools can say, no, we don't have the services to help your kid. You should try this place. So then, of course, your choice is actually smaller than it was, because maybe there's only one private school that has decided to invest in helping kids with this same sort of, who has a different learning plan than kids over here. And guess what happened? It turned out he was better off staying in Arlington public schools, and his kid got some services because the public school had to provide the services, and it was actually really good services.
I know a family in our neighborhood that had the same experience. They switched. Our kids are in public schools in Iowa. They switched from a private school to the public school, and it's been going much better for them. But again, to me, this is just a question of, okay, you want fairness, you want competition, you want choice, then actually implement policies that do that, as opposed to just saying those words. Because the law in the state of Iowa right now doesn't do those things. Most of the private schools have had their tuition skyrocket. So if the idea was, we're going to help you get this money so you can cover tuition, and then tuition skyrockets, it's still out of reach for those people. But I'm not sure that that's ever what this was about, because we also have no income limits on the program. So the wealthiest Iowans this year are using this program, where people in rural areas where they don't have private schools are paying state taxes. And now a lot of that money is going to wealthy Iowans to send their kids to private schools.
No, I mean it's what happens whenever you increase money into the system.
Yeah.
Who the beneficiary gets to, it becomes inflationary. They get to raise their
Yeah.
prices, and they will raise their prices. It's like that. All right, look, we're making a pretty good argument against this the school choice, but we're not. I want to hear you make your. Tell me how can we get, because I do think there's a lot of frustration that here we are. Basically, it's over 100 years since we started our public school infrastructure in this country, let alone in the state of Iowa or everywhere else. And it really hasn't changed, right? Like, I think this is why there's parental frustration here. I don't want to, the parents wanting something different is a real issue. Now, you and I are saying, hey, what you think is a fix isn't going to work the way you think it's going to work. So, what's your plan to improve public schools and, more importantly, to restore confidence in the public school system with these parents?
Sure. So we started a government efficiency program in 2019 that is so good at saving tax dollars, it's actually been copied in 2 other states. It's called PI, Public Innovations and Efficiencies. And it covers cities and counties too, but it also covers school districts. We have an incredible checklist of ways that they can save money. And the more of them that they implement, the more money they're going to save. And so what I would like the state to do, we have right now a really meaningful surplus that's presently just sort of sitting there. I would like us to actually start a revolving fund to help schools with the upfront cost for those efficiency investments. Because most folks know, if you're going to make some efficiency investments, you pay a little bit upfront and it pays off down the road. So we could use those state dollars to help dig in and make efficiency improvements. Those would help us do the things that we know make schools more effective: parental involvement, smaller class sizes, right? But you can do those if you're saving that money in a way where it doesn't necessarily cost more money. I think that's a no-brainer. And I don't know why we're sitting here in 2025 and it's only being proposed right now as opposed to already being done.
It does seem as if this has become such a partisan issue that Republicans feel like they have to be anti-public school, even if they want their local. I mean, we've turned it into almost a litmus test on the right. So make your case to a conservative that they should want to spend more time investing in the public school system rather than in a private school carve out.
Part of my belief in public schools is because of my patriotism. I love this country. This country is about democracy. It's about all Americans working together. The one place in our lives where we can meet everyone is when we are students in public schools. Whatever you do after that, whether it's you're going to college, well, you're going to college with people who go to college. Are you going to go be an electrician? Well, you're going to be an apprentice electrician with other folks learning to be an electrician, right? Whatever path you choose after that point is a narrowing experience. One of the best experiences you can have to understand just how good the people are who surround us is being a part of and supporting public schools, where the kids you are next to are the kids who are from wealthy families and from poor families. The kids you're there are from well-educated families or not well-educated families. The kids you're next to are from families with both parents working or zero parents working. But and you understand society, I think, so much better. And that gives you such a better sense of who we are as a state or as a country if you're participating in public schools.
Look, I went to a public high school in Miami, Florida that was in the late 1980s. It was a third Latino, third African American, third white. It was pretty segregated inside the school. I'm not going to sit here and say it wasn't. You'd have friend groups, but there were plenty of ways that it wasn't segregated. And in fact, you ended up with relationships because of a student activity. Maybe it was in sports, maybe it was in music, whatever it is. And it does give you a better understanding of the world we live in rather than some fantasy, isolated bubble. No, that's a good argument. Let me ask you this on Governor Reynolds. What's a policy what are some policies that you're going to keep if you're elected governor? What has she done right?
I was delighted to see the state require that public schools have a cell phone policy to limit the usage of cell phones. And I actually want to go back to one thing you had just said there about, the friends that you made. This weekend, I went home to Decorah, my hometown, and invited high school buddies to come over. and I was sitting there with two of my best friends from high school. One does construction work, bridge construction. The other one does auto body work. Their wives came over, their kids came over. We had a great time. One of their wives is a public school teacher, although she's in Minnesota. The other one, until very recently, was a teller at a bank. These are smart people, and I know them, and I know they have tons of common sense, and that they have great work ethic, and that they're smart because I spent 12 years in public schools growing up with them. And it doesn't matter what people's choices are after. I think that they're smarter than some of the people that I went to college with. And I think it's important to understand that you need to get that experience before you can understand that.
Right. No, it's good. Go back to Governor Reynolds. What's she done right?
Oh yeah.
The cell phone ban, anything else policies you'd like to keep that she's been doing?
I was happy to see that one done. I was glad to see the state government reorganization done for the most part. There were pieces of it that I wouldn't have done, but we had 36 cabinet level agencies in Iowa. I don't think that we needed that many. I don't know.
36? That's more than the federal government.
Yeah. So now we're down to 16. I don't know that 16 is the magic number, but certainly we did not need 36. So that was a good move.
Wow, 36. So you came of age politically during arguably the most bipartisan era in the history of Iowa, right? It was 1R and 1D for senators, literally 2 and 2, be a 2-2 in the congressional delegation, 3-2 when it was 5, going back and forth. You had 16 years of Republican governors, followed by 12 years of Democratic governors, right? And it was a very, and even now, right? There wasn't a clean Republican sweep. But Iowa has shifted, or it feels like it's shifted. Has it shifted, or is this a red mirage? Is this a Trump phenomenon that will look like an outlier 10 years from now?
So there's kind of two pieces of my answer to that question. One is there are still a huge number of Iowans that are focused on the candidate, not on the party, or, public service rather than politics. In 2022, Tom Miller and Mike Fitzgerald both ended up about 1% shy of winning their races for state treasurer and attorney general. If those guys had won, we would be the only state in the country with an evenly split delegation for the state offices.
For statewide offices.
That would be a measure where you could say literally we are the most purple state, right? And we were 1% off of that. So Republicans have won a lot of elections in Iowa lately, but Iowans are still just sort of looking for the person, right? And this is why this state, I think, went for Obama twice and then Trump 3 times, not because the state changed overnight, but because both of those guys were outsiders who promised to change politics.
No, I completely agree that they have more in common than they don't. That is what that bond of the voter was looking for an outsider. Shake up the system. Don't keep the system running as it's been.
Yeah.
So does that mean you're going to, do you think it would behoove the Democratic Party if Iowa were first in the nation on their side of the aisle again?
I do.
Make the case.
And we're gonna follow Iowa law. I'm not particularly concerned with what the DNC says, but
sure, but make the case to the DNC here. Like, why should they? Why should I? I know the case I'd make of why Iowa should be first in the nation, and I, folks who listen to me know my father grew up in Eastern Iowa, Waterloo. I've got more family buried in Edgewood, Iowa, than I do alive in the state of Iowa. So I'm an Eastern Iowa guy. I know the area well, and I think Iowans are good at doing this. But make the case that you have to make to the DNC to do this.
Sure, pretty straightforward. Iowans have been doing this for a very long time. Folks like yourself, I don't know if you ever said it specifically, but there were other reporters who, when they were here for the caucuses, would say, man, I've been in every state and I've done this for years. Nobody asks better questions than Iowa voters. Nobody's more into it. No one is more, I appreciate that you made a personal phone call to me Mrs.
Yeah,
Candidate, but
once,
I'm gonna
right.
still, yeah, I'm still gonna make sure that I have a chance to
Look, I
talk to
love my
and
friends
listen
in
to
New Hampshire
everybody
too.
else.
They ask tough
Yeah,
questions too. The New Hampshire voters good at this too. I've always said the two of you together are good at this. But
yeah.
anyway, go for it. No,
Well,
keep
but
going.
then, then the DNC comes in here and says, okay, well, Iowa, they complain about diversity, and they complain, I can't remember what the other thing was, but then they added a state that was less diverse. Oh, and competitiveness. And then they added another state that was also
It
less
was
competitive.
less competitive, right? Yeah. No, look, I actually think rejecting Iowa's first in the nation status is also sending a message to a whole group of voters that they don't want them to be Democrats.
Yeah.
And I think that is here, what they subtly, this is the message that I think the
Not too
short-term
subtle.
not at all. And I mean, look, Eastern Iowa is the great example. This is as democratic. It used to, you look, I don't have to tell you this. The state was basically the east side was Democrat, the west side was Republican, and literally Des Moines in the middle was the swing area, still is the swing area. But Donald Trump racked up all sorts of support along the Mississippi River and in where you grew up in Decorah. You've seen it firsthand. Is it as much of what did the MAGA movement do in Eastern Iowa, or is it what the Democratic Party didn't do in Eastern Iowa?
Look, it's always a little bit of 6 on one, half a dozen on the other, right? I mean, two things can be true at once. Again, keep in mind that during those presidential races, Democrats also nominated consummate insiders, right? I don't think that helped. Not in a place where people look at politics and they see a bunch of BS when what they want is people working together to just solve problems.
The last time you and I were face to face, I think it was in Decorah, and I was doing a piece about what happened to the Democrats in Eastern Iowa. And the one Democrat that these folks kept bringing up was Pete Buttigieg. They weren't bringing it up. They were like, Hillary Clinton never came in 2016. I'd hear that all the time. She never came. She'd fly to Des Moines, do a few events within driving range of Des Moines, and then leave again. And I heard similar complaints in 2020 by Biden and some of these others. But Pete was the one doing it the old-fashioned way. And he was showing up in these towns. And then, look who ended up overperforming in the caucuses. I'm shocked that campaigning worked,
Well, and I think that goes to the idea of listening, and how much that can matter to voters. Let me tell you a story from a month ago, Chuck, that still blows my mind. There's a conservative group in Northwest Iowa in what you would probably pronounce Gaza. It's Gaza here in Iowa, Gaza. They're the Gaza Patriots, and they're a conservative group. And they have a hard time getting some of the Republican elected officials in the state of Iowa to come there to do a town hall. I'm an open book. They reached out, said, will you come do a town hall? I said, absolutely. I went up there. We had a great event. I don't know if we had 70, 80, 90 people. We had Q&A, which they ended up pre-screening. Wasn't my request. When I do my 100 town halls, I don't pre-screen questions.
Say it
but
fast
they did
3 times.
I can't even say it once slowly. But when they announced, Chuck, that I was going to come talk to them, the Iowa GOP headquarters read them the riot act. They treated these Iowans like they owned them. And that to me is the kind of stuff that, man, it just makes me want to fight. The idea that a political party would call people and sort of tell them, don't you go listening to your statewide elected official? Don't you go and asking questions of this statewide elected official? There's something deeply wrong in the establishment of that party right now. And that to me is a great, great example of it.
Well, that's usually how party runs end in a state, where where you're so entrenched, you're so used to winning that you think you can bully, you think you can keep it up. That's usually the beginning of an unravel on that. Let me get you out of here. I want you to do a shorthand version of the lottery scam, because you wrote a book, you wrote a true crime book, and I think it's pretty good. It really reminds me of the McDonald's Monopoly scam. Because it was a similar discovery. And for those that remember that Netflix special about the McDonald's thing, this had to do with, was it Powerball and the mega? Because Des Moines is headquarters for a couple of
Hot
these
Lotto.
hot lotto,
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
multi-state lotteries. And I'm guessing you didn't even think it was as corrupt as you ended up finding out. Give me the elevator, I guess, the long elevator ride version of this story.
Sure. Bottom line is there was a guy who had the job of writing the code that was going to pick random numbers through a computer program. And he put a little bit extra into that code so that on 2 dates a year, if that date fell on a Wednesday or a Sunday, I think it was, if the draw was happening after 8 p.m., if all 3 of those things would meet, then instead of using a random number generator, it would use a 6 variable formula to sort of pick the seed. And so, of course, because he was an insider, he knew
what day this could happen, right?
And he would know what those variables were, so he could go out and buy a small number of tickets and guarantee a win. He, his best friend, his brother, and then some guys who were Bigfoot hunters, because his brother is one and they're believers.
Meaning like Bigfoot,
Sasquatch.
Bigfoot.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Somewhere. Yeah. Not just accidentally,
he might be somewhere out there in nature, but he is definitely in my book, which is called The Winning Ticket. They were able to have a good
Bigfoot story that only helps your true crime narrative. So it's well done.
They were able to get away with this effectively for a decade. And we found out.
So how often did they win? I mean, what were they doing? Were they being careful? Like not trying to win the whole thing, winning small, because, sometimes the best way to rip somebody off is not to try to get the big score, but like you get 10 medium-sized scores.
Yeah. No, I mean, the Iowa one was a very big one. They had a couple of tiny jackpots in there for 20K, but they were winning jackpots of over $1 million. And one of my favorite stories in the book actually is about how the first one, they actually had the FBI come and question the brother about how the money had gotten won. He was questioned while he was in a hospital bed because he broke both of his legs while falling out of a tree Bigfoot hunting. So there's that. But when Eddie, the mastermind, was trying to convince his best friend, hey, it's okay, don't worry about it, we can do this a second time. Right. One of the things he shared with him only at that point, after the best friend had already won one jackpot, was, hey, look, this is how easy this is. This is how sure I am. The FBI actually questioned my brother when I did this with him before I did it with you the first time. And the guy blew his top because that was the first time he learned about this other jackpot. And not only was there another jackpot, but also the FBI had questioned some of the people involved. So he got a lot less happy with his best friend after that point.
It's always nice when the people you're investigating aren't that bright.
You know what? This is human nature. And Chuck, we wanted to wrap it up. This is why we have checks and balances. This is why we want people to be led not into temptation. This is why the Constitution is a genius document, because when you give one person all the power, eventually they're going to misuse it. And they're going to make mistakes.
Before I let you go, what's been harder on the Iowa farmer, the tariff uncertainty or the AID contracts going away?
Good question. Most of the folks that I'm talking to right now are pretty focused on tariffs. I mean, it's just, you want to be able to grow what you're going to grow and fight for the price that you think is the right price. But when you don't know where the price is going because you have no idea what's going to happen next, it is so hard to make that decision. And most farmers, they want to sink or swim according to their own decision making. But when there's all this uncertainty out there, they are sort of trapped in this system that they have no control over, which then means they have very little control over their own success.
This is going to be one of those rare occasions where there's full bipartisan support against these tariffs in Iowa. We've seen Chuck Grassley; he came out very quickly trying to, because
he's the only one. He's the only one.
I am curious. Do you? And that's why I was going to ask you, has the state of Iowa filed onto that lawsuit against the tariffs or not?
I don't think so. And I would be shocked if they do, because our attorney general
But if you were sitting there, if you were working with Tom Miller again, would you be pushing him in that office to?
I think I like Chuck Grassley's answer. I would agree with him. If these tariffs work, I'm going to say amen, hallelujah. But I don't think they're going to work.
Yeah, it's hard to see how they're going to work. This is not the 1920s, and by the way, they didn't really work in the 1920s either. Rob Sand, it's going to be a fascinating campaign. You're going to be. There's a lot more riding on your campaign than maybe you may realize, which is, belief in whether Iowa's a swing state again, belief of if you win, I bet you first in the nation status comes with you. I know that's not why you're running for governor, but I just have a feeling that sort of the perception of the Midwest as a swing territory, the perception of Iowa, all of those things probably on your shoulders, whether you like it or not. I don't know whether you appreciate that or not.
I'm just going to do my job.
Well, look, it's going to be an interesting race. And do you expect a primary?
There's someone who's said that she'll run. We'll see if she really does. I got no problem with the primary.
And there's going to be probably a pretty big primary on the other side.
I would imagine so, but we'll find out. I'll tell you this: whoever comes out of it is going to be an advocate for lockstep. The agenda that Kim Reynolds has run that I think is unpopular in the state of Iowa right now.
I think it's a change environment.
A new direction. Yeah.
You're betting on that this is going to be a change environment, no matter who comes out in the nominee.
I'm a guy that looks at politics and is mostly disappointed with what it is, so I'm a change guy regardless.
All right. Well, Rob, I'll be watching closely, as you know, and hopefully I'll get you back here again.
All right. Thanks, Chuck.
Well, I have a feeling you should pin that interview with Rob Sand. There'll be interesting things in there. We may revisit it when 2026 comes, but you could argue how Rob Sand goes, so goes the future of the Democratic Party as a national party. They need to recover in places like Iowa if they're going to be a viable national party. All right, let's do a little Ask Chuck.
Ask Chuck.
First question comes from Peter, and he writes this. I listened to Jasmine Crockett interview where you discussed the Obama election. I was working in Texas. One day, many of my colleagues came back after lunch, all very joyful and happy. And one colleague told me that they had registered as Democrats to vote for Obama. Reason being, Rush Limbaugh told people to do that, as no way USA would vote for a black man, and they could somehow get Hillary to be the Democratic choice, which in turn would mess up the Democrats. I wasn't a U.S. citizen, so I didn't know what the effect of this Limbaugh idea was. So my question was there a study made on the Limbaugh effect? Best regards, Peter. I remember this. It was Operation Chaos, I think Limbaugh called it. He was trying to encourage Republicans or independents, not necessarily re-register, but where they could vote in a Democratic primary, to vote for Hillary to extend his theory was the longer the primary process, the messier it was, the better to keep the Democrats all tied up. The Republicans, McCain was largely locked up the nomination a bit earlier than Obama did. I believe there was an academic study or two, and it didn't really, there isn't many places where that seemed to have an impact. And I think whenever you get people trying to do that kind of voting, trying to organize sort of, vote in the other primary for somebody to mess things up. I think the informed voter might do it. My old man was a registered Democrat in the state of Florida at a time where if you wanted to participate in most elections, the only primaries that were competitive were Democratic primaries. But he was a Republican voter, but he was a registered Democrat. A lot of Southern Democrats were in this boat where they were registered as Democrats, but almost exclusively voted for Republican in general elections. So I remember in 84 distinctly, and not only that, in the Democratic primary in Florida back then in the 80s, there was a beauty contest, quote unquote, where you picked the candidate that you wanted in the primary, but then you had to actually pick the specific delegates for said candidate to represent at the national convention. So my father was one of those. He was petrified in 84. I'll never forget this. He was petrified that Gary Hart would be the nominee because he thought Gary Hart actually could beat Ronald Reagan in 84. He didn't think Mondale could, and he didn't think Jackson could. So he was trying to support Jackson. So he ends up voting Jackson in the primary and the delegates. It was less about voting for Jesse Jackson and more about trying to trying to improve Jackson's chances to weaken Hart. So, and there certainly is plenty of evidence that the long primary campaign hurt Walter Mondale in '84. But I think in hindsight, the long primary campaigns for Obama in '08 and for Trump in '16 didn't weaken the eventual nominees. They actually strengthened them. And I think one of the things that hurt Joe Biden in 2020 was cutting off the campaign so quickly. I wonder if the Democratic Party would have been better off as far as field. But I'll give you a perfect example. In Obama '08, Obama had that thing wrapped up. I would argue we knew after Super Tuesday he was directionally going to be the nominee. He had to collapse. And then, of course, after he did his Philadelphia speech, race speech, he put it away because there was just never going to be enough delegates, the delegate path, the way the Democrats distributed delegates. But Hillary kept marching on just in case, right? Just in case there was some revelation that would come out and destroy his candidacy, and she'd be there to pick up the pieces. So deep into May, right? They went all the way to June. Deep into May, we had a big primary night, Indiana and North Carolina. This was the night that Tim Russert famously said, we now know who the Democratic nominee is going to be. It's Barack Obama. And he declared the race. Closest anybody came on TV to declaring the race, although we had kind of been hinting at this. It was always funny to me that him saying it became such a gut punch to the Clinton campaign. They got really angry about this, believing this was now. But the fact is, North Carolina and Indiana, why am I singling those two states out? Well, those were the two surprise states that Barack Obama ended up carrying in 2008. Does he carry those states in a general election without actually having to run a competent primary campaign in Indiana and North Carolina in May of that election year? So my point is that by having to organize in more states for longer during that process in '08, what if Rush Limbaugh thought he was helping the Republican Party, extending the primary only made Barack Obama's organization better and stronger in more states. So I actually believe the more contested a campaign is towards the end, arguably it has, in the 21st century, it has actually helped that party in the general election.
Ask Chuck.
Next question comes from Steve in Vernon Hills, Illinois, and he writes, your double the size of the House idea may have merit, but where would one physically put them all? How would it work? The seating in the House chamber would look like economy seats on airplanes. And wouldn't that be great, right? Shouldn't they all have to be stuffed next to each other? It's the people's house, right? Look, this is always, I don't want office space to be the reason why this idea doesn't happen. But I do think that we're due for a new House office building. I think that the first woman Speaker of the House probably ought to have a building named for her. We have one for Joe Cannon. There probably ought to be one for Nancy Pelosi. And I'm not sure you strip off a name and put on a name. So I think we're due for one office space right now. Some argue is tight, but I actually would double the size of the House, but not double the size of the staff, right? So that you would have, I'd have, one more office building, but essentially you would narrow it down. I'd like to see members of the House have their bigger offices in their district. And that's where a large majority of their staff ought to reside. More of the staff ought to be in the district than in Washington. That your Washington staff ought to be literally the chief of staff, the legislative director, your communications director, and maybe a few other helpers, and that's it. That the large chunk of your work, if it's constituent services, should actually be taking place in the district. So that's, to me, I would we ought to reimagine what office space is like, and it really should be about office space in the district, not necessarily office space in Washington. And as for where do you seat them in the large chamber, look, they've added seats to that chamber before since we expanded the House for 120 years. So there's no reason why you can't come up with different ways to continue to expand the House seating chart and things like that. I think you could do it without making us feel like we're all sitting in Southwest seats. But I certainly think the bigger question is where do they have their offices? And this is where I would flip the script here. Districts should be where a lion's share of the staff and offices are. And literally it almost should feel like a cubicle when you're coming to Washington. That's, to me, what a citizen legislature for a representative democracy ought to behave.
Ask Chuck.
All right, last question for this episode. Dom from Easton, PA. I believe that's the home of one Larry Holmes, the most underappreciated all-time heavyweight champion of the world. Let me go. I've been thinking a lot about the issues facing American democracy. Wouldn't it be smart for a group or party like Andrew Yang's Forward Party to become dedicated to this one cause? Similar to how the Forward Party endorses candidates that are registered Republicans or Democrats, this new American Forward Party can support candidates and officials on both sides and independents who decide to support legislation that would end gerrymandering, overturn Citizens United, or vote to expand the U.S. House. Is there an appetite for this? Well, you just described the much of the agenda of the Forward Party, and it's funny you bring up the Forward Party. I'm actually going to have the chair of the Forward Party on this podcast pretty soon, hopefully before the end of this month of May, and we will ask her about that. I've been doing some deeper dives on what they're up to. In theory, No Labels was trying to get to this place that you're describing, where they could create sort of a caucus or a coalition of the willing, if you will, of left and right on different issues. I think I've always thought if No Labels made a mistake, it was assuming there was an actual centrist ideology. And I think that what there really is a pragmatic ideology, meaning people that are willing to compromise to make incremental progress versus people that want the issue and it's their way or the highway, right? And that to me is the difference between a partisan legislator and a politician, right? A politician figures out how to do the best they can with what is offered. And so, but I look, it's been the theme of this podcast at the top. I think there's a vacuum out there for a whole bunch of Americans who feel like they're not represented very well by the Democrats or the Republicans. And there are pieces of ideas that they like in both parties. So the idea that you can have one third party do anything is, I think, I get why that seems like, there's no perfect compromise there. But I do think I think there's a vacuum out there and there's going to be an appetite for this. And again, look, some of it is going to be by necessity. Do we have a John Cornyn decide he has to run as an independent? That's an opportunity for the Forward Party, right? Ditto with Tillis, or ditto with this Jason Pizzo in Florida. So some of it will have to do with what kind of, will we see a better quality of candidate running as an independent in some of these spots, or running as a non-traditional member of either party. And I think that's, some of it is, you have an idealistic, you have an ideal in your head of what that candidate would look like. Is there anybody that will actually resemble that ideal? And we'll see. I think it's a little early, but I know I'm hopeful that there's some attempts to shake up this system, because it's clear the two-party duopoly is not good for the democracy. All right. With that, I ought to lament the lottery. I know I closed the last podcast with begging you guys for good vibes, so thanks for nothing. I have teased. By the way, has somebody paid attention to what's going to happen to the three teams in the state of Texas? Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, those three NBA teams, they're all on the rise. They're all in a position of strength all of a sudden. And it's a state that prefers football and baseball over basketball. It's we'll see if if this sort of changes, but this is a state that loves its football and loves its baseball. And basketball has always been fine. And there's certainly, Baylor's had a good program, UT's had a good program, don't get me wrong. And Houston obviously has been one of the powers in college basketball off and on for years. But as it has never been at the core, and yet the NBA, the three franchises there have never all three been on this strong a footing at the same time. Anyway, that's going to be fascinating to watch build on that front. As for my poor Wizards, I mean, it was such a Wizards ending. Not only did they not get it, they didn't even get a top 4 pick, didn't even get a top 2 pick, end up in the 6th spot. Who knows? You never know who you draft in 6. Jokic was drafted in the 2nd round. Giannis was down deep in the lottery and, grew 3 inches after he was drafted. So, you can always hope. But boy, go look at the NBA draft history and see how many players in the top 3 become all-stars versus how many players in the rest of the first round become all-stars. So it's a bummer not to get one of those first 3 picks. All right, that's enough with my sports update. Again, like and subscribe everywhere we are, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, you name it. And oh, by the way, we now have a weekly Substack that you can subscribe to as well. So go check it out there. And with that, until we upload again.